Hello, everybody. I'll let people in as they join. Welcome to the CTEL Meet and Eat event with Professor Don Passey. Please note the event is being recorded and it will be hosted on the Centre's YouTube channel. Please use the chat function freely and frequently. Let us know where you are. What's the weather like there? What was the highlight of Don's paper for you? Has it nudged your own research in any way? Um, Meet and Eat is one of the regular spots in our event series run by the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster University. Meet and Eat has this particular characteristic of being a hybrid seminar and discussion group with the added benefit of us potentially all having something to sustain and nourish the body as well as the mind. So if it is culturally acceptable and you're comfortable doing so, please feel free to take on food and drink while we're listening and while we're engaging. I ought to note importantly for those joining us at the moment or just joined us, the event is being recorded and it will be hosted on the Centre's YouTube channel. There'll be a link to the YouTube channel in the chat in a few minutes. If you'd like to give us a follow, it'd be much appreciated. And you can also click to subscribe and be notified when new events are posted there. So that's good. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by Professor Don Passey with the Department for Educational Research at Lancaster University. I'll introduce Don in a few minutes. Before I do that, I'll just bring out a few administrative points and notices. While we're running through these introductory points, please do feel free to use the chat function as some of you are doing. Just say hello. Let us know where you are. And of course, in the Centre tradition, we'll all enjoy a brief synopsis of what the weather is like wherever you are as well. Hopefully, if you're on the call at the moment, you've got a copy of the paper that Don's going to speak to, either flat or in 3D again. Just in case there are people who didn't receive that poster, I'll put the link to Don's paper in the chat in a few minutes. The event is a game of two halves, really. It's generally around 45 minutes to an hour each way, so around 90 minutes in total. Some are shorter, some take longer, and that's fine too. In the first half, Don will treat us to an uninterrupted overview of aspects of his paper from his researcher's perspective, which is a rare treat for any of us. To have the luxury of his insight and his vista on those things, and there'll be food for thought for the second half in that, where we can open up the discussion to all of us and hopefully have plenty of questions and discussion points for Don. Perhaps while Don is speaking in the first half, we can make notes and questions that we might raise in the second half. Of course, we can feel free to type those questions into the chat function, along with general observations and reflections on his unfolding words and how they resonate. The remarks don't have to be particularly well formulated. Please just feel free. If it is an actual question for Don that you're typing, if I could just ask you, start it with a capital Q. And when he's finished, I'll ask on your behalf. I'll assume if you've typed it in there that you don't want to be on the recorded, and I'll ask on your behalf. Alternatively, just feel free to write, I have a question for Don, and I'll get to you. Or you can raise your hand either on your own camera or using the Zoom hand raising function. And I'll take those in the order that we see people, hopefully not missing anyone. I would politely request, if you're comfortable doing so, that you mute your microphone while Don's speaking, but also if you could leave your camera on if you're comfortable doing so. Of course, with the caveat that we're being recorded and hosted on the YouTube channel. Having the odd camera on it is, it is comforting for, and it's reassuring for people presenting. Please also note, of course, as if we were physically co-present, please enjoy your sustenance, food and drink. I will be enjoying a low-calorie feast that I've got hidden somewhere here while further marking up Don's paper. So moving along to our superb, seminal and generous speaker, Don Passey. Don's a stalwart of the Centre and of the Department for Educational Research at Lancaster University. Lots of us on the call at the minute have benefited from Don's wisdom and generosity over the years. And I can see some of us who've had more direct benefits, through supervision as work, colleagues, mentoring, and his influence, of course, on the TEL programme and other research partnerships. Don is a Professor of Technology Enhanced Learning at the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University, and he's an honorary professor in the Institutes of Information Technology and Education at Amity University in India. He's a seminal voice with the International Federation of Information Processing, where he chairs the Technical Committee on Education and vice chairs the Technical Assembly. No mean feat. Don has published almost 250 different outputs with pan-governmental and governmental bodies, NGOs, third sector lobby groups, private organisations, educational institutions, and his research notably always focuses on policy and practice in education. And Don has kindly agreed to discuss with us today his paper, which will be in the chat shortly, Digital Technologies and Teacher Wellbeing, with, of course, that clinically placed and eyebrow-raising question mark, which we're certain he's purposefully positioned to provoke us from the start. Thanks, Don. Please do feel free to shout at me if I need to do anything and haven't noticed. Otherwise, I'll jump back in when you're closing. Over to you. Thanks in advance.
Super. Thanks, Phil, and thanks for that very kind and generous invitation, and also a bit of background about me. Yeah, and thanks very much for the invitation to join you over this lunch, and I will make it a meet and drink rather than meet and eat, as you are expecting me to say something, so the eating might be a bit difficult with the talking. So I'll try the drinking instead. Just yeah, when I was asked if I'd be willing to run a session, I was asked about to provide a specific paper, and it took me a little while to think about which paper I would like to put forward for discussion. And I decided on this paper, Digital Technologies and Teacher Wellbeing, which I wrote a few years ago, just around the time of the COVID pandemic. And I think it would be right to say something about the background to this paper. In essence, the digital technologies at that time were developing rapidly and were being used in widely different ways in some respects when the COVID pandemic happened. And actually, as a result of that, there was often quite a lot of press coverage about how digital technologies were negatively affecting users. There wasn't actually very much about the positive effects of digital technologies, even though it was quite clear that actually digital technologies were a major enabler during the COVID times. They not only enabled forms of social interaction to continue, but also they were protective in terms of their abilities to be able to engage, but at a distance, so that lockdown could be contained. So even those sorts of obvious benefits were really quite missing from the media. And it did become quite a sort of a negative view. And so I became interested in this idea of, well, what do digital technologies do? They clearly can enable social interaction. They clearly can enable isolation in crisis situations such as that during the lockdown. And I was aware of the fact that there had been literature that had been published around well-being and digital technologies, but it mainly focused on the ways in which teachers were using digital technologies rather than this wider picture of what is teacher well-being and how might digital technologies support that well-being. So I really wanted to reframe some of the questions away from the idea of how do you use digital technologies best, to the idea of how do you use them, or are the ways in which you are using them which are supporting you in terms of teacher well-being. And I'd undertaken a number of studies at that time, looking at how teachers were using digital technologies in various settings. And it was clear to me that some of the things that were coming out of those, although they weren't necessarily focused specifically on an exploration of teacher well-being, there were things that were coming out which were quite clearly supporting those teachers in terms of their wider well-being. They felt better in some respects because of the uses of digital technologies in certain ways. So I became curious about this, and that's really the background of it. So I wondered how really to do this and how to do it when there wasn't very much there to start with in terms of the focus that I wanted to take, which was to do with this idea of how do we look at teacher well-being? What does teacher well-being mean? And then how the use of digital technologies support that wider concept of teacher well-being? So really, the paper was very much a conceptual paper because there wasn't really a fixed concept to start with that would enable me to look at that. So I had to build something in terms of some form of conceptual framework. And I wanted to do that through the paper. But I wanted to use the evidence that I got from a number of studies that would enable me to start to look at that. But where I started really was to think about the whole concept of teacher well-being and what it might mean. So one of the early ways in which I started to look at that was the work of Ryan and Deci. And they really provided a conceptual basis for teacher well-being. And in one of their works, in one of their papers, they said that it appears to be essential for facilitating optimal functioning of the natural propensities for growth and integration, as well as for constructive social development and personal well-being. That was related to three particular factors which they felt were important in terms of well-being, teacher well-being particularly. That there should be competence, there should be relatedness, and there should be autonomy. In other words, teacher well-being was to do with these three ideas of what are the forms of competence that one needs and should have and should develop? What are the forms of relatedness, i.e., what is it and how are you relating what you're doing as a teacher through to others? And then autonomy, how is it that you can function as an individual within this wider context? And that was really the background to where I started. And there were others. Dodge, for example, with others, had said that the balance in terms of well-being, that it's something to do with a balance, that it was to do with a balance between an individual's resource pool and the challenges faced. So this was more to do with the idea of the interactions that were going on. And that interested me in terms of how one might be thinking about the ways in which digital technologies might be introduced and involved in those interactions that were going on with teachers when they were using them. But I suppose one of the key background documents that I drew on was from Saville Smith, who said that there were a number of things that should be considered if one's looking at well-being. One is work-life balance. The second is symptoms experienced to do with signs of mental health. The third is work issues. And the fourth is ways in which mental health problems are experienced and alleviated. Now, this was an interesting perspective because this looked at it very much from a work-life balance and was looking at it in terms of the ways in which external individuals were influencing that work-life balance and how the individual therefore was thinking about it. And I wondered whether digital technologies were in any way supporting that or not. Were they there in terms of enabling that work-life balance in the way that would work for the teacher, for the individual? But at the same time, considering the negative concerns that have been raised in the media, were there indicators that actually the digital technologies, instead of supporting, were actually mitigating against the work-life balance? Because I was certainly aware of the fact that some teachers at that point were very concerned about the levels of communication that were happening via email, for example, and were feeling very overloaded. And not only overloaded at particular times, but pretty much overloaded generally across a day. So their work-life balance for those individuals was clearly being affected. So how were all of these things working together? So I could, in a way, I could see the ways in which the literature on teacher well-being as a whole could link to the use of digital technologies. So using that really, I was interested therefore in trying to put together some form of framework that would enable me to identify the features and factors, because what was coming out of this was that there were a whole range of different features and factors that were affecting teacher well-being. And if I could find those factors, maybe I could then start to identify them through studies that I'd already done as to how they might have been influenced or not influenced, negatively or positively. So I looked particularly at the literature that had already been explored that related to digital well-being. I looked at the literature on effective uses of digital technologies for supporting teaching and learning. I looked at the digital literacy literature and the digital agency literature. And from that, started to draw together a pattern, if you like, of how it was possible to think about the different factors from those elements and the literature concerned with teacher well-being as a whole. And eventually I came up with an initial framework that drew those together. And then I looked at the elaboration of that in terms of the factors. So the initial framework and the initial models came from the literature. They didn't actually come from existing studies that I'd done that might have shown what was happening. This was coming from literature that was definitely associated with teacher well-being in some way or another. And I came up with what in the paper is Table 1, which is basically a list of factors that were known to influence teacher well-being that could be associated with the different features that I explored through that range of literature. So using that, I then took each of the studies that I felt might contribute in some way towards identifying whether these factors were influential or not. Did they have an effect? Did the digital technologies that were being used in particular ways, could they show any influence through those factors? And I chose 5 particular studies that I'd looked at and used them to match against that range to see what might come out. And what did come out was that, interestingly, the prime factors which appeared to be involved in terms of teacher well-being with digital technologies was actually the influence upon learners. So if teachers were content that the use of digital technologies was positively influencing outcomes from learners, then their well-being was enhanced. They would feel better. about what was happening and better about themselves. Looking at the other end of it, I didn't really identify particular negatives. And this was an interesting one because in the situations that I was exploring, the negatives which had appeared in the press, in the media, had actually all been managed by the teachers or the schools in which those studies were done. So what didn't come out from what I was looking at that stage was any of the negative effects. I was picking up on the things which were more positive. But the things which didn't come out, which weren't being highlighted, were how digital technologies were affecting mental well-being. So the positive effect of technologies upon supporting teachers in terms of their mental well-being didn't tend to come over. Um, there was another study that was done after this, after I'd written this paper, that looked at this whole area specifically. And one of the interesting things there was actually, and there were a large range of teachers that were interviewed in that later study. What was interesting there was that from those interviews, actually, teachers didn't tend to think about their mental health. So they weren't actually thinking about the ways in which the digital technologies might support them or not in terms of their mental health. What they were thinking about was actually the health of others, about the well-being of others in using the digital technologies, which was itself quite an interesting outcome, I think. And maybe that's a feature that is, I don't know whether that's a feature that's more specific to teachers or not, but it's certainly a feature that came out very strongly. I.e., that the whole range of teachers that were interviewed at that time didn't tend to be thinking about themselves. They tended to be thinking about others. The only time that they were thinking about themselves was if managers, i.e., principals or heads of school or whatever, or parents were having a negative effect upon them. And in those cases, they were thinking about their mental well-being, but otherwise it didn't come into play. So interestingly, of course, it was also clear from some of those interviews and from the paper that I put together that actually the digital technologies themselves could support those sorts of practices. There was some work done in Finland, for example, which I quoted in this paper, which showed how, for example, parental contact could be managed by the use of digital technologies, either positively or negatively. So out of that, I out of that came really this idea of, was this a workable framework? Was it something that could be used? Was it something that might be used in other situations? Um, and the purpose really of this paper was to identify a potential starting point for looking at this whole area of use of digital technologies and the wider concept of teacher well-being. And I was pleased that it was used in a study at a later time. And also I've had inquiries from a number of people asking if they can use the instrument in order to gather evidence about uses of digital technologies to explore teacher well-being. So I think that probably gives a background to the paper. I mean, I don't really want to go into more detail, I don't think, unless you want me to delve into particular aspects of it. But I'm trying to give you an idea of the rationale behind it, where it came from, but also the fact that I felt at the time that I was exploring it and writing it, that the media had a particular view of things that I didn't necessarily share, because of what I'd seen in practice. It didn't seem to relate. And I wanted to try and see if it was possible to explore this through another angle, through a different lens, and to identify actually how digital technologies might positively support, rather than being seen as something that's always negative, in terms of well-being. And certainly that doesn't mean that I haven't come across instances of where there are negative impacts of digital technologies on teacher well-being. I have, but they then tend to get into the media, whereas the ways that the technologies are supporting doesn't tend to get into the media. And we still see this to some extent now. We still haven't really got a balance between how digital technologies are supporting positively and how they're supporting negatively, and how, if they are supporting negatively, how we can address that so that they can shift in terms of being more positively perceived and used. So that's the background. That's the background to the paper. And yes, so I hope you see why the question mark was there and deliberate. And that was in essence, that was the question I wanted to ask myself when I was putting this together, and the question that I wanted to ask everyone else, really, who had any thoughts about this, because I think it is an important and genuine question, and one that I've sometimes taken up with particular groups. I remember being in a meeting with an education authority, where the use of emails was being seen by some teachers to be completely overwhelming. And I just said, well, how is it being managed? How is this being managed? What's the policy with regard to how this is happening? Why is it that these emails are getting through to teachers after 5 o'clock or before 9 o'clock in the morning? Who's handling that? How are they being scheduled, or how are they being stopped from being seen? I think it's a really important one, that there are ways in which the technologies can manage the situations, but often those aren't being used. They're leading sometimes to situations that shouldn't happen, I think. But anyway, I'm gonna stop there, and I'll open the floor in case I've stimulated any sorts of questions at all. I hope I have, but let's see.
You never know. That's great. Thanks, Don. It's superb and insightful and useful as ever. So as we said at the start, feel free to type into the chat or raise a hand. It's entirely up to you. And we'll take questions in order. Hopefully not missing everyone. Oh, Brett, straight in.
Yeah, thanks, Don. It's really interesting. I mean, it's interesting how often we end up having to do studies just to counter the negative perceptions of media and other organizations who take either radically negative or extremely unrealistically positive views of technology as a whole at different times. And I remember this time. I think the thing that I'm particularly interested in this paper is your method, actually. This notion of case reanalysis is something I wish people would do more of. And what you've done is applied a framework to cases where that framework wasn't originally used, obviously. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about, first of all, why you chose these cases and what they were, how they were intended to bring together a picture overall, and the extent to which using this new framework allowed you to highlight things that might not have been at all obvious in the original cases. I think these are the two things.
Okay. Thanks for that, Brett. And yes, I certainly agree with your comments about a policy in the media. So yeah, okay. So what I did was, when I started to put this framework together, I did I started to think, well, how am I going to explore this more? How am I going to see if it's worth putting it together, really? If it does it do anything? Does it tell me anything? So I thought back. I thought back over the previous 2 to 3 years of the studies that I'd been doing and thought about those where I might have seen some ideas of teacher well-being coming out. So just to give you one example that's in there, I remember going into a school to explore how they were using a software package in order to support the teaching of mathematics. This was a secondary school. In order to support the teaching of mathematics, where the class that I was observing and the teacher that I was observing, the class was basically not wanting to do anything with regard to mathematics. They were, I think, what you might call withdrawn. But through the use of this software package, the teacher actually found that they became engaged with mathematics. And so what she did was she developed the use of the software so that it would support lessons in the longer term. So she was aware of the fact that what she wanted to do was to use elements of this software at particular times during the lesson to heighten, to enhance the engagement, which would then flow over into the other sorts of activities that she wanted the children to do. Now, I was able to interview her afterwards, and what came out was fascinating, because she didn't realize that what had happened was that it was affecting her emotional state. So basically, when she went into lessons previously without the use of that software, she was actually dreading the use. Yeah, she was dreading what would happen when she went into that classroom with that particular group of children. And what came out was the fact that suddenly she was actually enthusiastic about what the structure of the lesson would be, what the content would be, what outcomes she thought would arise, how she would check the use with the children, etc. It had completely changed her emotional state. So for me, that was an example of where I felt that certain factors along that list might have been affected. But actually to check, I needed to then go back to that study, and then I needed to reanalyze what was there and look at it in terms of how that would fit with the factors. So basically, I was sort of ticking off the factors that were being affected, that I felt were being affected at particular times. And so I was able to get a pattern. So I was able to get a pattern for that particular instance. And then for each of the 5 cases, I did similar patterns, which I then brought together. So I knew which, for example, which of those factors were there for all 5 cases and which were there for none of the cases. And then it was a question of, okay, I can understand why they're there for 5 of the cases, because I can see how they're influencing across that wider spectrum, which was interesting for me, because I felt that if they were there for 5, maybe that's one of the factors where actually quite a lot of influence can happen. For those where there was 1 or 0, that posed a question. I suddenly felt, why? Why am I not seeing any of these cases, or very few of these cases, highlighting these as factors? And so I then had to start to think about how to answer that question. And some of that, of course, I could speculate about, and some of it I didn't have any evidence about. So I had a fair idea of why that might be the case. And it wasn't really until that follow-up study was done and those teachers were interviewed using actually using the instruments that I'd created from this conceptual paper that I was able to identify why those were the case. And one of the reasons was this idea that actually when teachers were using digital technologies, they weren't thinking about their own well-being. They just used them because they thought it was a good thing to do. Yeah. Whereas they weren't thinking about them in terms of how am I going to benefit as a teacher? How am I going to benefit as a person? How is my emotional state, my mental state, my social state going to shift? Is it going to be better as a result of that? Those are the sorts of questions that teachers weren't asking. And my guess is actually that many teachers don't ask those questions now. Yeah. But that's so that was I don't know whether I've answered both of your questions, Brett.
No, you did. Thank you, Don. I'll just say also, you might be also um, helping to counter the narrative in the media about lazy, selfish teachers as well. In some, well, they don't even think about their own well-being. They're focused on the well-being of their students. Is not the sort of thing we hear much in various newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's I was just amazed really um, by what by what I was finding in both in those original studies, but also in that follow-up study, in terms of the dedication and commitment that was coming out. That actually some teachers were indicating how difficult they were finding it to switch off from thinking about what was happening in classrooms and with their children, etc., with their students, and that clearly was could lead to particular concerns. It could lead to particular issues. It could affect their long-term mental health if they can't switch off from that. And that was becoming clear from those sorts of interviews that were happening. But it was at the same time indicating that deep dedication and commitment that was coming out. And I think that that's common. My experience of working with people and going into situations where there are teachers, it's my experience that that is common. There is a huge commitment and dedication, and I agree. It doesn't come out. It doesn't come out through policy and the media. There is, there are. I could name them, but I won't. But there are policy people who've actually indicated quite clearly, and these have been ministers of education, that they've basically felt that teachers are lazy. I mean that's just totally, yeah, it's just ridiculous. It's completely incredulous. Um, and goes against so much of what the research says and what practice says. And I would say to those ministers, get yourselves into classrooms, get into a school, get into a university, get and see what people are doing instead of thinking about what you think they're not doing, because you would be wrong. And I have said that to some people in policy.
It'd be interesting, wouldn't it, if you went to an educational technology, I don't know, expo or something like that? How many stands would be talking about teacher well-being rather than, all the other stuff that sells more, I guess. Michael, please ask away.
Hi, thanks very much, Don. That was fascinating. Yeah, you mentioned earlier on, and I think also in your last answer, that about subsequent studies that used your framework. I wondered if you could say any more about how was that developed further? Did they add or change any of your statements? That would be quite interesting. And was there any validation studies done of it as well?
Okay. Okay, thanks, Michael. Yeah. The follow-up study was done in Ireland, and it was done within a range of primary and secondary schools, both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. So it was a study that looked at teacher wellbeing and digital technologies across the whole of Ireland, which is interesting because, of course, the curriculum and the management are quite different in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. So they work to a very different system. So in Northern Ireland, it's very much there is, for example, a complete networking infrastructure which which links every school together. There's a common networking infrastructure, and there's a common hardware and software policy that goes right across Northern Ireland. That's not the case in the Republic, where schools are much more able to do things in their own way. So there isn't that underlying infrastructure in the same way. There isn't the same degree of policy with regard to hardware and software. So it's a very different technology situation, a very different management situation. And therefore, it was quite interesting to see what would happen when that came out. What came out of that was actually that there were other factors added as a result of that study. So they identified some additional factors that were added into the framework. But the other interesting thing that came out of that was, again, the pattern overall was roughly the same as the pattern that I'd found from the reanalysis of the case studies that I'd undertaken. So again, you got this quite you got these numbers of factors which tended to be very common across all schools, both primary and secondary, and both in the Republic and in Northern Ireland. And then you got the others that didn't tend to come up. And again, it was to do with that division between those where the digital technology was supporting others, where it was supporting children, where it was supporting management, where it was supporting social engagement, where it was supporting engagement with parents, etc. Those tended to be the ones that came out at the top very high. And then the ones that tended to come out at the bottom were the lack of ways in which the teachers were thinking about how it was affecting them positively. So again, it was to do with not them not really thinking about how it was supporting them in any strong way. So yeah, that was the follow-up study. And then I've also had I was asked about the use of the framework, which of course I've agreed to. And I haven't heard anything further about it, but one of them was a study in Turkey, and the other one was a study in Finland. But I've not had any follow-up to those. I hope I will. It would be interesting to see what comes out of it. And I did indicate to the researchers at the time that I'd be very interested in what was coming out. So yeah. Does that answer the question, Michael? I'm not sure.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Something you're interested in following up then, Michael?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it will be interesting to use it as a survey tool, in my context, certainly.
Yeah.
And try to sort of do a validation study of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Great stuff. I think next we had it was close, but I think we had Maria and then Renat.
Okay.
Hi. Hello. Thank you for a really insightful presentation. I'm also very much intrigued by the issue of the media. So and to be honest, recently we did a study with academics, a local study, and one of the issues that we were focusing on was also we were asking them questions about well-being, and actually when we were asking the question in the interviews, they were, with no exception, focusing on the students' well-being, as for your case, in the case of the digital technologies for teaching. And this study was not specifically on the use of digital technologies, but it was on the academic experience. What also came out of this study was a number of tensions of the belonging to the academy, at the same time the unbelonging, and many of the issues that started to come out about the unbelonging, my suspicion is that they have to do with their well-being. So although sort of there is that focus, when you specifically ask the question, it's sort of the focus goes directly on the students. But then when we started digging about other identity, it started to come out that, look, these issues have to do also with their well-being as well. So I'm not sure whether in the follow-up studies you were finding something similar emerging.
That's really interesting, Maria, and certainly this idea of this concept of identity is very, very important in terms of well-being. So, you know, the things that Ryan and Deci were saying originally about well-beings very much relate to identity, and you've got within that you've got a number of different features of identity. So you've got the feature of personal identity, but you've then got the feature of identity within an organization or within a group. So you've got a group identity or a social identity. And one of the things that came out from the follow-up study particularly was how the communication from senior managers could affect teacher identity and their feeling of belonging to the institution, and how that affected their well-being. So as soon as there was communication going on where they felt that they didn't belong to the same extent, they couldn't associate themselves with that institutional message or with that institutional view to the same extent, their well-being was affected negatively, which is an interesting one. And again, I mean, you know, it's very much related to the current context of some of the reports and research that's coming out with regard to social media, and how messages of identity there are affecting the well-being of individuals. But for teachers, it was particularly the senior management. So the messages that senior management were putting out, they felt needed in many cases to be more carefully considered, because it could actually affect how they were thinking about themselves and their relatedness. Yeah, coming back to Ryan and Deci's term, relatedness to others within their institution and to the institution itself. And it was often through either emails that were coming from senior management, or from messages, for example, that were putting out through social media like Twitter, as it was at the time, or through websites. And this could have a negative as well as a positive effect. And that was coming out through those interviews. So yes, I can absolutely understand, Maria, that you know, these concepts of identity and belongingness are very, very important in terms of the wider concept, and clearly digital technologies can affect them both negatively and positively. There was actually one school where, as a result of this, the principal had set up a means of communication whereby the teachers could comment on messages that were going out before they were sent out. So the principal was trying to avoid the negative impact of messages that would go out widely. Because certainly some teachers were feeling that it was affecting not only the way that they were thinking about the institution, but the ways that others outside of the institution, parents, for example, would be thinking about the school. Again, which would have a negative impact upon them. They wouldn't feel happy about that. Their contentment would go down. And that would affect their well-being overall. And it was interesting that there were certain individuals that seemed to be more sensitive to that. So some individuals could just ignore it, whereas other individuals were much more sensitive to those forms of communication. And what was interesting there was that the interviews that came out suggested that there were a number of factors that grouped together that led to that greater sensitivity. So a number of the factors were having a less positive effect. They were having more of a negative effect, and they were basically working in conjunction, if you like. They were exacerbating the issue. They were leading to a negative outcome. Don't know whether that, but certainly, interesting to hear of the study that you've been doing, Maria, and the outcomes.
But this is also very, very interesting, and the points that you were making now also about you know a number of factors coming together, sort of sensitizing people to, which is
Yes, and it's almost like the interviews are almost suggesting that there's some sort of almost what I would call a pivot point. You know, there's a particular factor. There appears to be one factor where the sensitivity might be greater, and as soon as that is affected, it then can have an effect upon those other factors, and they can all start to combine together. I mean, not for every individual, but certainly for a range of individuals, that seemed to be the case, that there was this idea of almost of a pivotal factor, something that the individual felt was particularly important in terms of their identity and their belonging. And as soon as that was affected, that then started to affect other things. Yeah.
So there is reason for more studies exploring.
Yes.
There is, yeah. Seems to go across a few different sectors and settings, Maria, doesn't it? Yeah. That's great. Thanks, Maria. Renata, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thanks, Phil.
Please ask away.
Hi, Don.
Hi, Renata.
My study is on extended reality and language education in particular. And I learned a lot more from your paper than I thought I would. And I really like the way you're using the self-determination theory and the concepts within your framework. Some of the questions I have for you come from the fact that I've worked for over 15 years in widening participation. And I always feel in research like that it's really important to specify what types of school we're talking about. We know that teacher workload in some of the most deprived schools are higher. They have less resources, less time for training, and for learning new skills. And so I would really like you to tell us a little bit about the schools that you've worked with and whether any of them fall in that category. I was interested that you put digital literacy within, not within autonomy, because for me, autonomy, I've been interested in autonomy for a long time, and this idea that you have the skills, you have the time to go and do learning, a specific technology, to then use it effectively in the classroom. So that feeling that you know what you're doing and you can use it to the best. For me, it was within that category. So I was quite interested that you put in a different place. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
And my third point is that at the very end, you say that there's some areas that you haven't been able to get enough data, and one of them is teacher workload. And is that right? In my experience, teacher workload is the main worry. I know teachers personally. I've worked with teachers a lot. Some teachers look exhausted most of the time. And you mentioned presentism, which I could really relate to that. So if you could speak a little bit more about that too. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Renata. Okay, so picking up on your first point, the schools I worked with were very wide. So these were not schools that necessarily were working with children who had the greatest social advantage. They weren't necessarily schools where resources were unlimited. They were schools where, in some cases, there was social deprivation, where children were disadvantaged, and disadvantaged not only socially, but also disadvantaged in terms of their abilities to access resources, and also their abilities to be able to engage with others. So I've worked in and have drawn on schools that have covered a very, very wide range. So I've drawn examples from, for example, primary schools that are in socially disadvantaged areas, and I've also drawn from schools that are in effect grammar schools. So, I've also drawn from schools that are schools specifically to support children with special needs. So, I mean, I've been in and I've looked at uses of digital technologies right across the spectrum, and I'm always keen to do that. I'm not looking for specific instances and cases, and that was also the case with the follow-up study that was done across Ireland. So does that help in terms of the first one, or is there anything else you want me to add on to that, Renata?
Yeah, I know. I don't know if you're going to continue with that, but it might be worth comparing the outcomes from different schools in the future if that's something you continue to work with. But I appreciate the fact that, there is a wide range of schools. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to draw upon that wide range so that I wasn't actually getting I wanted to avoid any forms of bias as far as possible in terms of the reanalysis and also that follow-up study. So yes, I'd want that wide range as far as is possible. What I haven't done, and I'm not aware of anyone else doing at this stage, is to look at it in terms of particular sectors. So whilst within that follow-up Ireland study, there were some levels of comparison drawn between primary and secondary teachers. I'm not aware of it getting any finer than that. It hasn't been looked at, for example, with regard to, let's say, teachers who are in rural setting schools compared to inner city schools, or schools that might be in particular localities compared to others. So that sort of level of comparison hasn't been done to my knowledge, which could be an interesting one, from the point of view of how certain factors might be coming into play in certain locations or within particular settings.
I agree.
Yeah. So the second point, Renata, was about autonomy. Whenever one's putting together some sort of model where one's combining things together, I always grapple with how to do that. How am I best going to show this? And could I do it in a number of ways? And of course, for a journal article, trying to show that in 5 different ways wouldn't be probably they wouldn't find that very acceptable. They just want a single diagram of how are you going to show this to us? I would say from my point of view, I think I wouldn't say that the model that I've shown is necessarily the right model. It's not something where I would say I would actually argue this to the nth degree. It's the problem here is that all of those areas intersect in some way or another, and therefore trying to show that intersection can be quite difficult. In some respects, I'd quite like to go into 3D modeling with it, but trying to show that on a 2D page is also not very easy. So I gave up with the 3D modeling idea and came back to the 2D modeling. But you're right. It's certainly very easy to demonstrate how there are other ways of putting those things together. I suppose for me, the important thing was that all of those are considered. That all of those aspects should be considered in terms of their contributing to the wider picture. I offered a model which I think is one way of looking at it, but I certainly wouldn't argue with someone else's way of looking at it. I think that's entirely appropriate and entirely reasonable. So it's not something where I have a fixed idea on it. If I came back to it, I might very well remodel it in a different way, because I would be rethinking it in terms of potentially a different context, a different set of background. And that's one of the difficulties, I think, with models, is one has to be careful that a model isn't something which is not questioned. I think models should be questioned always. That's why we're in research, that we're constantly questioning what is happening and what we're doing as much as possible. So I'm very happy that you questioned that. No problem whatsoever.
Thanks, Don.
Yeah.
Generous.
And sorry, the third point was...
It wasn't necessarily a question. The whole idea about workload and the fact that perhaps you didn't get, there wasn't enough data to talk about it, because what I see, is that teachers have unsustainable, really, workloads, and that has an impact on the students' learning inevitably, and their ability to keep up with developments in technology.
Absolutely. And in my experience, actually, one of the key problems here is that teachers only talk about workload when it's too late. What happens is that if I were to go now into any institution and ask the teachers about their workload, they'd be really modest about it. They'd actually not give me a true figure, probably because they couldn't. because in any one day, it's they don't really record what they're doing in terms of time, because there's so much time that's given to thinking about things in the background that they wouldn't know, for example, whether to commit that to work or not and how to do it. So it's there are really difficult questions to ask about workload, and it's really difficult to get real answers. And teachers don't tend to tell you all of the bits that they're doing. They tend to be very, very modest about what they do. But as soon as someone becomes overloaded, that's the time when you hear about it. And that's really unfortunate, I think. I don't know how one gets through this, because I'm aware of the fact that workloads continue in some areas to increase, and that's certainly the case with teachers. And yet we're not really tracking what's happening here. We're tending as teachers, I think, to take on board the workload, and we don't really start to say anything about it until it becomes on the edge of becoming too much. And that actually, of course, is usually too late. We should be trying to do something about it before then. How do we identify when is the right time to be picking up on that, and how do we start to do that? And it's from the point of view of teacher well-being, it's a really crucial, these sorts of issues and questions are really crucial. We know that there are teachers that are coming out of the profession because of the fact that they have mental health issues as a result of the consequences of overburden and overworkload.
And
therefore,
language learning is 5 years. 5 years they stay in the profession and then leave.
Yes.
So when they actually becoming mature teachers, and then they leave.
Yes. Yeah. So it's I think certainly workload is a key factor with regard to teacher well-being, and we don't really have sound data on it, and we don't have ways of conceiving how to pick up on this and to help to look at ways to be able to address it where it's becoming problematic. Most teachers just get by, I would say.
Thank you very much, Don.
Okay, thanks, Renata.
Right. Thanks, Renata. Very insightful stuff. Don, if I could ask a question to maybe look forward, since this was published, and certainly since you did the underpinning work for it in terms of the research, a lot seems to have changed in, if not in the material reality, then certainly in our awareness of these different modes of physically co-present, online, blended, high flex. And I guess people like Ryan and Detchi and Dodge and Saville Smith, they might not have foreseen those different modes when they presented their original work, but they have offered us a way of thinking about them through balancing resource pools and recognizing different commitments and competence, relatedness and autonomy and stuff. So I guess from your perspective, 3 years later, if you look back on your framework now on those 4 alternative contexts for teacher well-being, is there any one or maybe 2 of them that you think you ought to keep a particular eye on for your future endeavours, or do you see them as more or less in balance, or is it a ridiculous thing to try and distinguish between them, do you think, in either positive or negative way?
Thanks, Phil. Really interesting question. I mean, I think what's coming out as a result of the use of technologies that have often been derived from and following the COVID pandemic is that more teachers have become more familiar with wider uses of digital technologies. Now, what's interesting as a result of that is that it is creating, I wouldn't call them, differences. So, for example, coming back to those comments I made earlier about people being overloaded by email. One of the interesting things here is if you talk to a range of teachers about the ways in which they want emails to come through and how they want to handle them, they can be quite different. So one teacher, for example, that I spoke to not so long ago was quite happy to have emails from anybody between 5 and 8 in the evening. Because that teacher felt that that was the right time to be able to handle things. What the teacher didn't want was the teacher didn't want emails coming in between 9 and 5, because that would ruin what the teacher wanted to do in terms of the social engagement. And that was the thing not to be interrupted. But in the evening, no problem. Now for that teacher, if the policy forced the teacher to handle the emails between 9 and 5, that would actually negatively affect that teacher's well-being. And yet in the same institution, you can have a teacher who only wants to receive emails between 9 and 5. So what's starting to happen is that the uses of technologies are being seen by different individuals in different ways, and how those can be managed needs to be done on a more individual and personal basis. So policies have to be careful of being able to accommodate those differences in order to support the well-being of each of those individuals effectively. So for me, one of the things that came out of that really was this idea that for that teacher who wanted the emails between 5 and 8, if that happens, then their emotional state is going to be positively enhanced. Now they recognize that. So they're starting to recognize the value of the management of digital technologies as well as the use of it. So for me, one of the things that I think is interesting to explore more about in the future is how individuals are managing the technologies rather than just using them. So in the past, the teacher well-being has been more affected by the ways in which teachers have used technologies with their pupils or students. It's been that's been a driving force behind their well-being. Whereas now what we're seeing is that as a result of COVID, often individual teachers want to manage the technologies in different ways. And therefore, those different ways of managing, I think, are going to be really interesting to explore. So in a way, what we could be seeing is more individualization with regard to how technologies are supporting with well-being, rather than working at an institutional policy level. So in a way, it's suggesting that we need to think very carefully about what policies we're creating, because they must not affect, if we can help it, the well-being of the individual. And if we do, we've got to do something about that. We've got to pick that up and think about how to address that. So I guess for me, it's more to do with looking more at these management and policy connections with well-being and digital technologies that I think is starting to come into play more. I don't know whether that answers your question, Phil.
Does. It's great. Thanks, Don. Yeah, I guess we could be, irrespective of the mode we try and examine and improve, we might kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, or unsettle something else that we didn't mean to, maybe. And I guess teachers and others need to maybe they need to prioritize themselves and their own well-being, even if they're encouraged to see that as leverage for supporting the well-being of others. I don't know.
I think so. I mean, there is this sort of very ancient old adage that one cannot take care of others if one cannot take care of oneself.
Yeah.
And actually, I think there is some truth in that. And I think it is really important that we are able to engage in practices and activities that will support ourselves. And okay, at the same time, we do have to consider others, yes. But we're not going to be in a position to effectively consider others if we're not able to think about how we can help ourselves. It's through our self-understanding in some respects that our abilities to help others arises. In essence, we're reflecting on the practices that we apply to ourselves and how they might apply or not to others. So, you could say that in one sense, we're modeling practices on ourselves to see how that might affect and contribute to and support others. So, yeah.
That's a nice note for us to start ending on, I guess. So we'll start tying a nice bow around it, unless anybody's got any more questions or points to add. So it is regrettable, but it probably is about time we began to close things down. Don's probably got more inspirational research that he needs to get to, as some of us have. Thanks, Don, as ever, for being so forward-leaning and for volunteering to speak with us today in the face of all those competing demands on your own time. On our best wishes for those further papers, books, and keynotes that you're working on. Thanks also to Kate, who's on the call and who's taken over from Brett, who's on the call as co-chair of the centre. And thanks, of course, to Brett for his sterling work over these past years. We do need to just recognise that this is around about Brett's time of stepping down. So this centre event, I think it's fair to say, marks the first for an incredibly long time where Brett can relax and take part without needing to orchestrate something behind the scenes or do absolutely everything. So hopefully, Brett, you've enjoyed your new role. Most importantly, thanks to everyone else for giving up time and capacity to make these centre events so collegiate and fruitful. Please do keep an eye on the CTEL social media channels for news of the video of today, and of course for other events and news, including our subsequent Meet and Eat event in 2 weeks, if you're watching this afterwards, which will be at the same time as today on Tuesday, 19th of November, 2024. And that will be with our new centre chair, Dr. Katie Jordan. We should note that was organised prior to us knowing of Katie's appointment. So a happy coincidence rather than any forethought and planning. If you can't make that event, perhaps catch up on the centre YouTube channel. And we'll see you on we'll see you for the centre meeting on the 27th of January 2025. So see everybody at something. Thanks again, Don. Thanks, everyone. Cheerio.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you. Thanks, Don. Good to see you. Bye.
Thanks.
Cheerio.
Bye.